10 prehistoric discoveries too terrifying for history books. Number 10. The Tarim Basin mummies. Deep in the Taklamakan Desert, in the Xinjiang region of northwestern China, salt flats and bone-dry air have done what embalmers elsewhere spent centuries trying to achieve by hand. Bodies buried here as early as roughly 4,000 years ago did not simply decay away. They dried out intact, down to eyelashes and the stitching on their clothes. Chinese archaeologists excavating the Shaohe Cemetery in the early 2000s found row after row of boat-shaped coffins wrapped in fresh cattle hides sewn shut, each one marked above ground by a tall wooden post. Dozens of those posts still stood when excavators arrived, some carved into oar shapes, some carved into a form researchers describe simply as phallic. A cemetery marked not with names, but with an unmistakable symbol repeated grave after grave across centuries. Inside, the dead wore pointed felt hats with feathers still attached. Wool textiles survive in colors still faintly visible. One woman was buried with a small leather pouch, and inside it, researchers identified residue of a fermented dairy product related to modern kefir, one of the oldest cheeses ever recovered anywhere, packed as a grave good and apparently intended to travel with her. For decades, what troubled scholars most was not the preservation. It was the faces. Some of the mummies have deep-set eyes, long noses, and reddish-brown hair. Features that, combined with tartan-patterned wool textiles technologically similar to fabrics from Bronze Age Europe, fed a theory with real political weight attached to it. That these were not a local population at all, but migrants, most likely speakers of an early Indo-European language, who had crossed thousands of kilometers of steppe from the west and settled a region that later became, and remains, ethnically contested. In 2021, a large international team led by Christina Warrener, then jointly of Harvard University and the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, working with Chinese geneticists including Yinqiu Cui and Chao Ning, published a genome-wide analysis of the earliest Tarim Basin mummies in the journal Nature. The result overturned the migration theory entirely. These people carried almost no genetic signal from Bronze Age steppe populations or from any outside migrant group at all. Their ancestry traced instead to a much older, mostly vanished population known as the ancient North Eurasians, a lineage that had otherwise all but disappeared everywhere else on the planet by roughly 10,000 years ago, surviving here, isolated in one of the driest, most unforgiving basins on Earth. The mainstream interpretation now holds that the Tarim Basin mummies represent a small, deeply isolated population that had lived in place for millennia, adopting foreign technology without absorbing foreign genes. Others point out that isolation this extreme for this long is itself almost as strange as a migration would have been, and caution that a small number of sequenced genomes cannot fully settle the population history of an entire basin. A minority position keeps the door open for later, smaller waves of contact the current sample may simply have missed. What is no longer disputed is the direction the evidence pointed. Not west, but nowhere at all. These people had not come from somewhere else. They had simply been overlooked. The unsettling part was never the mummies' faces. It is how confidently an entire migration narrative got built around them, for a generation, without ever asking the bodies themselves. Wheat and dairy from West Asia. Millet from East Asia. A medicinal plant called ephedra from Central Asia, still packed into some graves for reasons no one fully understands. A people who touched 4 different agricultural traditions and were claimed, wrongly, by none of them. But an isolated population, dead of natural causes and buried with evident care, is one kind of story. The next site holds bodies that were never buried by people who loved them whole, because the people responsible for how they ended up in the ground were still deciding which parts of which person belonged together. Number 9. Cladh Hallan, and the ancestor who was never one person. On South Uist, in Scotland's Outer Hebrides, archaeologist Mike Parker Pearson spent parts of the 1990s and 2000s excavating a Bronze Age settlement where, unusually for the period, The dead had been buried directly beneath the floors of the houses the living still occupied. Beneath 3 roundhouses at Cladh Hallan, his team found the skeletons of 2 adults in classic crouched burial position, alongside younger remains, bodies people had apparently walked over, cooked over, and slept above for generations. Something about the male skeleton was wrong from the beginning. The skull's wear pattern suggested one age at death. The jawbone suggested another. The teeth pointed to a third profile entirely. In 2012, geneticist Terence Brown of the University of Manchester published ancient DNA results in the Journal of Archaeological Science, confirming what the mismatched bones had already implied. The male mummy was not one man. He had been assembled from the head, torso, and limbs of at least 3 different people. When Brown's team tested the female skeleton buried nearby, sampling DNA separately from the skull, jawbone, arm, and leg, they found the same pattern. Different individuals, different bones, combined into a single body and buried as one. Isotopic and taphonomic evidence indicates the component bodies were treated in a way consistent with short-term mummification soon after death. Likely rapid burial in a peat bog, an environment that halts decay by starving bacteria of oxygen. And then, in at least one case, kept above ground and curated for a period of years, possibly longer, before final burial beneath the roundhouse floor. Someone assembled these composite bodies on purpose, then chose to live alongside the result before finally putting it in the ground. Think about what that requires. Not one death mishandled. At least 6 separate deaths across 2 composite bodies, each contributing exactly 1 usable part. A skull here, a set of limbs there, recombined by people who had access to multiple sets of human remains and made a specific, repeated choice about which pieces to keep together. Why assemble a person out of several people is the question every researcher studying Cladh Hallan eventually has to answer. And none of them answer it quite the same way. The leading interpretation holds that merging remains from different individuals, possibly from different family lines, created a single symbolic ancestor, a composite figure whose presence beneath the floor could anchor a household's claim to land, status, or descent more powerfully than any one real person's body could. Others suggest something closer to practicality. Bog-preserved remains may simply have been a resource, kept in storage and assembled from whatever was on hand when a burial became necessary. A minority reading goes further, proposing the composite bodies conceal an irregularity in the family line the community needed buried along with the bones. A substitution no one outside the household was meant to notice. What disappears at Cladh Hallan is not a person. It is the assumption, so basic that most people never examine it, that a skeleton is automatically the remains of one individual who lived one life. Every visitor who has stood over a Bronze Age grave and imagined a single continuous life ending in that spot has been making an assumption that at least twice in one Hebridean settlement was simply false. The composite mummies of Cladh Hallan erased the boundary between one identity and several. The next site removes an even more basic boundary, the one between a body and a meal. Number 8. Cowboy Wash, and the evidence a body leaves after it has already been eaten. In the summer of 1998, archaeologists excavating 3 pit houses near Cowboy Wash in southwestern Colorado uncovered the disarticulated, cut-marked remains of at least 7 people. Men, women, and adolescents scattered across the floors of a small ancestral Puebloan settlement abandoned in a hurry around 1150 of the Common Era. The bones carried a signature researchers had, by then, learned to associate with the deliberate processing of a human body for food. Cut marks at the joints, long bones broken open lengthwise, skulls with the base removed, evidence of burning afterward. None of that, on its own, proved cannibalism. Butchery marks can come from ritual defleshing, from secondary burial customs, from violence that stops well short of eating another human being. For decades, that ambiguity let researchers argue over the same handful of ancestral Puebloan sites without ever closing the case. Cowboy Wash closed it, using evidence no one had thought to check before. what was left in the ash of a cold fire pit inside the third structure. A single human coprolite, preserved feces, had survived undisturbed at the site for roughly 850 years. In 2000, biochemist Richard Marler, then at the University of Colorado School of Medicine, published results in the journal Nature from an assay run on that coprolite. Marler tested for myoglobin, a protein that exists only inside skeletal and cardiac muscle tissue, never in blood, never in the digestive tract itself, never produced anywhere in the human gut. If myoglobin turns up in human waste, it did not get there on its own. It got there because muscle tissue was eaten. The assay came back positive for human myoglobin and negative for every other species tested. 20 control samples from comparable Puebloan sites tested the same way showed nothing. Then Marler's team checked one more object, a cooking pot recovered from the same structure. Residue scraped from its interior surface also tested positive for human myoglobin. Not a burial, not a battlefield, a meal cooked in a specific pot, digested, and eliminated by someone who was, based on the evidence in that fire pit, very likely one of the people responsible for what had happened in the two houses next door. What the coprolite proves is narrower than it sounds, and Marler has always been careful about that boundary. It cannot say why. It cannot turn one isolated, possibly desperate act into proof of a culture-wide practice. The mainstream interpretation treats Cowboy Wash as the clearest biochemical proof of cannibalism at any prehistoric North American site, tied to a period of drought, violence, and settlement abandonment across the wider ancestral Puebloan world around that time. Others argue that a single event at a single site, however well proven, cannot be extended into a claim about ancestral Puebloan society more broadly. And some descendant communities have objected to how the finding was generalized in the press. A minority position keeps the interpretation narrowest of all. Something violent and extreme happened in one place, on one occasion, for reasons the coprolite itself can never explain. No coprolite lies. That is what makes this entry different from almost everything else on this list. Cut marks can be argued about. A single piece of preserved human waste, tested twice, checked against 20 controls, cannot be read as anything gentler than what it is. A body processed for food leaves evidence in the ash of a cold fire pit. A body that drowns leaves something else behind entirely. Sometimes, against every reasonable expectation, it leaves the very tissue that had once done the person's thinking. Number 7. The brains of Windover Pond. In July of 1982, a construction crew clearing a shallow pond near Titusville, Florida for a stormwater retention basin pulled up a bucket of dark peat with a human skull inside it. Work stopped. Florida State University archaeologist Glenn Doran took over the site, and across the following field seasons, his team recovered the skeletal remains of 168 individuals from the mud at the pond's bottom. Men, women, children, and infants. Some interred with wooden stakes driven through woven fiber mats to hold their bodies in place underwater, submerged there deliberately, according to the excavators, as a form of burial rather than disposal. Radiocarbon dating placed the burials at between roughly 7,800 and 8,300 years ago, making Windover one of the oldest cemeteries identified anywhere in North America. The peat itself, low in oxygen and stable in acidity and temperature, had done something peat bogs occasionally do to human remains in northern Europe, but almost never in a Florida climate. It stopped decomposition in its tracks. Alongside the skeletons, Doran's team recovered some of the oldest woven textile fragments found anywhere in the Americas. Twined fabric that should not exist after 8,000 years underground, and does. Then came the detail that made Windover a site people outside archaeology still talk about. In 1986, Doran published the first analysis of the pond's most extraordinary contents in the journal Nature. Intact human brain tissue, recovered from inside intact skulls, in a climate where soft tissue is not supposed to survive more than a few years, let alone millennia. Brain tissue was eventually documented in an estimated 90 of the burials. Shrunken, altered by thousands of years underwater, but structurally intact enough that researchers could still identify individual anatomical folds, and intact enough to extract and sequence ancient human DNA directly from neural tissue, rather than from bone or tooth enamel, the only sources most archaeogenetics research anywhere else in the world has ever had to rely on. 8,000 years is not an abstraction easy to hold in the mind. It is roughly 320 human generations. It predates the wheel, the pyramids, and writing itself by thousands of years in every direction. And for that entire span, wrapped in cold, oxygen-starved mud, something recognizably shaped like a human brain sat waiting, inside a skull, inside a pond, for someone with a bucket to find it by accident. Windover forces an uncomfortable recalibration of what gone actually means. Soft tissue is supposed to be the first thing time erases. Skin within weeks, organs within months, brain matter faster than almost anything else in the body. The people buried at Windover were not preserved by any ritual or intention beyond, apparently, choosing to bury their dead underwater rather than in the ground. The preservation was an accident of hydrology and chemistry nobody at the time could have predicted, which makes it stranger, not less so. An entire population whose innermost tissue outlived them by 8 millennia for no reason anyone chose. The community that used Windover Pond for burial did so across roughly 1,000 years, generation after generation returning to the same shallow water with their dead. What they could not have known is that the same choice that honored their people would, 8,000 years later, hand modern researchers something almost no other archaic period population on Earth could offer. Not just bones to measure, but tissue to sequence, and, in a very literal sense, the physical remains of how those people's minds had once been built. A pond in Florida kept a mind intact by accident for thousands of years. A cave on the other side of the Gulf of Mexico kept something just as improbable. Not a mind, but a single, frozen moment of a life ending, sealed inside a flooded pit that no one was meant to find at all. Number 6. Naya, and the black hole that kept her exactly as she fell. Divers exploring a flooded cave system on Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula in 2007 followed a passage down into a vast, bell-shaped chamber the local cave diving community had already nicknamed Hoyo Negro, the black hole, for the way their lights simply vanished into it without finding a far wall. At the bottom, scattered across the chamber floor beneath tens of meters of water, they found bones. Not one skeleton, dozens of individual animals, some belonging to species that have not existed anywhere on Earth for thousands of years, and among them, one remarkably complete human skeleton. A research team led by James Chatters, an independent paleontologist working with Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, published the first full analysis in the journal Science in May of 2014. The skeleton belonged to a girl of roughly 15 or 16 years old, and radiocarbon and uranium series dating placed her death at somewhere between roughly 12,000 and 13,000 years ago, making her, at the time of publication, one of the oldest and most complete human skeletons ever recovered anywhere in the Americas. Researchers named her Naya, after the water nymphs of Greek myth. The chamber itself explains almost everything. During the last ice age, when sea levels sat far lower than today, Hoyo Negro was a dry pit, its entrance a deceptively small opening in an otherwise flat cave floor, dropping away into a chamber with walls too sheer to climb back out of. Naya's pelvis shows a fracture pattern consistent with a fall. The most likely explanation researchers have proposed is almost unbearably mundane. During a period of drought, when a chamber like this might have held one of the only remaining sources of standing water for kilometers, she went looking for a drink, misjudged the opening in the dark, and fell. Ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, bears, and an elephant relative called a gomphotherium fell into the same trap across thousands of years, drawn by the same need and caught by the same architecture, their bones settling into the same floor as hers. Then, the water came. As the Ice Age ended and global sea levels rose, the water table beneath the Yucatan rose with it, slowly flooding cave systems that had stood dry for the entire span of human presence on the peninsula. Hoyo Negro filled gradually, entombing Naya and the animals around her in darkness, and, eventually, in water cold and mineral-rich enough to preserve her skeleton essentially undisturbed for the next 12,000 years. Naya's real significance was not her age. It was her mitochondrial DNA. For years, a genuine puzzle had troubled the field of American archaeology. Skulls from the oldest known Paleo-American skeletons tend to look measurably different from the skulls of later Native American populations. A gap some researchers used to argue for two biologically separate ancestral migrations into the Americas, rather than one. Naya's genetic signature matched lineages found only in modern Native American populations, while her skull retained the older, distinct Paleo-American shape. One girl's DNA closed a debate that had run for decades. The skull shape had changed through ordinary evolution and population change over thousands of years, not because two unrelated peoples had crossed into the Americas at different times. The mainstream reading now treats Naya as strong, direct evidence for a single founding population behind both Paleo-American skeletal traits and modern Native American ancestry. A minority of researchers still argue that one skeleton, however informative, cannot fully settle a debate about an entire hemisphere's peopling, and continue searching for evidence of the more complex migration patterns proposed in older models. Somewhere beneath the black water of that chamber, in absolute darkness broken only by the lights of the divers who visit it now, a teenage girl still lies exactly where she landed almost 13,000 years ago, sharing her resting place with saber-toothed cats and giant sloths that met her exact fate, mistaking the same hidden opening for the same last promise of water. The mystery Naya settled took 12,000 years to answer and one genome to close. The next lake took a different shape entirely. Instead of one girl in one moment, hundreds of people, dying, it turns out, not in a single event at all, but in at least two, 1,000 years apart from opposite ends of the ancient world. Number 5. Rupkund, and the lake that turned out to be two disasters wearing one location. High in the Indian Himalayas, at an elevation of roughly 5,000 meters, a small glacial lake called Rupkund freezes over for most of the year. When the ice retreats each summer, it exposes what has made the lake locally famous for generations. Hundreds of human skeletons, scattered across the lakebed and its banks, visible enough that trekkers have been stepping around bones and skulls here for decades. The story above ground begins in 1942, when a forest ranger patrolling the Nanda Devi Sanctuary reported the remains to British colonial authorities, who initially suspected a hidden Japanese military unit, given the ongoing World War. That theory collapsed almost immediately once the bones were examined. These people had clearly been dead far longer than any 20th century conflict could explain. In the absence of an obvious answer, local legend filled the gap. One well-known version describes King Justaval of Kannauj, his pregnant queen, a company of dancers, and their servants, caught on a Himalayan pilgrimage by the wrath of the goddess Nanda Devi, who supposedly punished the group's disrespect by summoning a hailstorm of stones hard as iron. A National Geographic-funded expedition examining the skeletons in the early 2000s found something the legend had, in its own way, already predicted: skull and shoulder injuries consistent with blunt trauma from something round, delivered from directly above, roughly, researchers noted, the size of a cricket ball. Whatever had killed a significant number of the people at Rupkund, it had come from the sky. For decades, the working assumption was that Rupkund recorded one catastrophe, one pilgrimage group, one storm, one bad afternoon centuries ago. In 2019, a team led by geneticist Edwin Harney, then at Harvard University, working with an international group of roughly 24 additional researchers, published a genome-wide ancient DNA analysis of 38 Rupkund skeletons in the journal Nature Communications. The results did not confirm one disaster. They revealed two, separated by roughly 1,000 years, involving people who had never known of each other's existence. 23 of the 38 individuals carried ancestry consistent with present-day South Asian populations, with radiocarbon dating placing their deaths at approximately 800 years into the Common Era, a time frame broadly consistent with the hailstorm death pattern the earlier trauma study had documented. But 14 more individuals carried ancestry closely matching populations from the Eastern Mediterranean, genetically similar to people living in Greece and Crete today. Radiocarbon dating placed their deaths roughly 1,000 years later, around the year 1800 of the Common Era, recent enough that photography already existed elsewhere in the world. One further individual carried Southeast Asian-related ancestry, adding a third, still unexplained thread to the lake's population. Two separate groups of people, from opposite ends of Eurasia, separated by roughly a millennium, ended up dead in the same remote alpine lake basin, at an elevation few people anywhere would travel to casually. The South Asian deaths fit the pilgrimage and hailstorm narrative reasonably well. The 19th century Mediterranean group fits nothing anyone has yet proposed with confidence. No pilgrimage route, no trade record, no expedition log has been matched to their presence at Rupkund. And the study's own authors were candid that this finding raises more questions than it answers. The mainstream interpretation now holds that Rupkund preserves at least two unrelated mass death events, separated by centuries, layered accidentally into a single striking site. Others caution that a sample of 38 out of several hundred skeletons scattered across the lakebed may not capture the full complexity of who died there or when. A minority position keeps the Mediterranean group's presence entirely open, ranging from a lost party of travelers to a specific, still unidentified historical expedition. What no interpretation disputes is the arithmetic the DNA delivered. Not one tragedy, but at least two, centuries apart, sharing a single address at the bottom of a Himalayan lake. Each summer, the ice retreats a little further, and the meltwater exposes a few more bones to trekkers who did not expect their hike to end at the edge of an unsolved question spanning 2 continents and 1,000 years. Rupkund's dead came from 2 different worlds and 1 lake. The next site's dead came from 1 world and 1 lake too, except every one of them was placed there on purpose, by hands that meant exactly what they did. Number 4. The skulls on stakes at Kanaljorden. Ahead of a railway construction project near Motala in central Sweden, archaeologists began excavating a site called Kanaljorden in 2009, expecting the usual scattered debris of a prehistoric settlement. What they found instead, across the following field seasons, was a shallow Mesolithic lakebed with a 14 by 14 meter platform of tightly packed stones built deliberately across its bottom, and, resting directly on top of that platform, 10 human skulls. Fredrik Hallgren of the Cultural Heritage Foundation led the excavation and the years of analysis that followed. Radiocarbon dating placed the skulls at approximately 8,000 years old, among the earliest and most elaborate ritual sites involving human remains ever documented in Scandinavia. 9 of the 10 skulls belonged to adults. The 10th belonged to an infant. None of the skulls still had a jawbone attached, deliberately removed based on the cut marks Hallgren's team identified, sometime during the mortuary process rather than lost to decay. 2 of the skulls still held something else. Fragments of wood, lodged inside the cranial cavity that had entered through the foramen magnum, the large opening at the base of the skull where the spinal cord normally passes through. Wooden stakes, in other words, had been driven up into these skulls from below, mounting them on poles before the entire arrangement was carried out into the shallow water and set down onto the stone platform. This was not one killing, discovered and buried in a single afternoon. The care in the stonework, the consistency of the jaw removal, and the staggered radiocarbon dates across different skulls all point toward a practice repeated over time. People returning to this same shallow lake more than once to add another mounted skull to a growing, curated collection. A later study of the assemblage's cranial trauma, published in the journal Antiquity in 2018, added a detail that changes how the whole site should be read. Several of the adult skulls carry healed depression fractures. head injuries serious enough to have plausibly killed the person outright, that these individuals nonetheless survived, sometimes more than once, well before their eventual deaths. The people mounted on stakes at Kanaljorden were not chosen at random from a peaceful community. Several of them had already survived violent trauma earlier in life, then eventually died and had their skulls prepared, mounted, and displayed in the same manner regardless. That is the detail that turns Kanaljorden from a single strange ritual into something colder. This was not one violent afternoon that a community responded to by building a shrine. This was a practice, applied over time to people whose bodies already carried the marks of having survived violence once or twice before death finally caught up with them, and whose community's final act was to memorialize them by driving a stake through the base of the skull. Why display the skulls this way remains genuinely contested. The mainstream interpretation treats the site as a form of ancestor veneration, a way of keeping the community's dead visibly present at a location of ongoing ritual significance. Others read the pattern as trophy display, arguing the missing jawbones and staged mounting are more consistent with marking the remains of defeated outsiders than honored kin. A minority position suggests something closer to a closing ritual, ending the site's use altogether by depositing its most significant remains all at once. Coincidence in any one detail is possible. The combination, stone platform, missing jawbones, mounting stakes, an infant among 9 adults, and evidence of survived prior violence, is harder to read as anything but deliberate. An infant's skull, prepared and mounted the same way as the 9 adults around it, is the detail most people cannot get past. Not an accident of preservation, not a chaotic mass grave, a choice, repeated, that treated the smallest and most vulnerable member of the group exactly the same as everyone else. Kanaljorden shows what people could do to the already dead with total control and unhurried intention. The next entry belongs to a pit that predates Kanaljorden by more than 400,000 years, and holds proof that at least one person inside it did not die a natural death at all. Number 3. The Pit of Bones, and the oldest murder ever proven. Deep inside a cave system in the Atapuerca Mountains of northern Spain, a vertical shaft drops away inside the rock. A natural chute dropping many meters straight down, too steep and narrow to descend without deliberate effort, reachable only by squeezing through tight passages and then climbing down carefully into total darkness. At the bottom lies a chamber researchers named, with blunt accuracy, Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones. Since excavations began there in the 1980s under paleoanthropologist Juan Luis Arzuaga of the Universidad Complutense de Madrid, researchers have recovered the commingled skeletal remains of at least 28 individuals from the chamber floor, the largest collection of Middle Pleistocene hominin fossils found anywhere on the planet, belonging to a population usually classified as Homo heidelbergensis, widely considered an ancestor shared by both Neanderthals and, more distantly, our own species. Uranium series dating places the remains at approximately 430,000 years old, a span of time so far outside ordinary human experience that the pyramids, agriculture, and even the first stirrings of art in the archaeological record all sit far closer to the present than this chamber's floor. How so many bodies ended up at the bottom of a shaft that dangerous has been debated since the first bones surfaced. This is not a place people fall into by accident, again and again, across generations. Reaching it requires deliberate, repeated, physically demanding descent, which means either individuals were dying elsewhere in the cave system and their bodies were carried to the shaft and dropped in on purpose, or, more unsettling still, this specific hominin population had already developed something resembling a deliberate mortuary practice, choosing this shaft as a place to put their dead, 430,000 years before anyone would think to call it a cemetery. One skull in that count carries evidence that turns speculation about how these people died into something closer to certainty about how at least one of them was killed. In 2015, Researchers led by Nohemi Sala of the Centro Nacional de Investigación sobre la Evolución Humana in Burgos, working with Arsuaga's team, published a forensic analysis of cranium-17 in the journal PLOS One. The skull shows two distinct fractures on the frontal bone, just above the left eye socket, and trajectory analysis indicates both wounds were made by the same object, striking from two slightly different angles. Either blow alone would very likely have been fatal. The presence of both, delivered in close succession, points, according to the study's authors, toward one conclusion: deliberate intent, carried out by another member of this same small, ancient community. Consider what that implies. Long before modern humans existed as a distinct species, long before Neanderthals had fully diverged from the population that produced them, something in this line of hominins was already capable of premeditated, repeated, lethal violence against one of its own. And, based on the shaft itself, some version of a community response to death organized enough to carry that victim's body into one of the most physically demanding parts of the entire cave system and deposit it there specifically. The mainstream interpretation, laid out plainly in the study's own title, Lethal Interpersonal Violence in the Middle Pleistocene, treats cranium-17 as the earliest solidly proven case of one hominin killing another anywhere in the fossil record. Some researchers caution against importing a modern legal category like murder onto a society whose social structures cannot be reconstructed from bone alone, preferring the more careful, clinical language the study itself chose. A minority position questions whether all 28 individuals reached the pit through the same process at all, suggesting some may have fallen in while still alive, searching for water or shelter, unconnected to cranium-17's fate. What is not disputed is the skull itself. 2 blows, 1 object, 1 victim. 430,000 years before the word murder existed in any language spoken by anyone. A single victim, hidden at the bottom of a shaft only the community itself could reach, is one form of violence, private, deniable, folded into the ordinary business of disposing of the dead. The next site holds the opposite. Hundreds of victims, whose bodies were never hidden at all, because the people responsible wanted every detail of what they had done left in plain sight. Number 2. Alken Enge, and an army defeated twice. In the wetlands of Alken Enge, in Denmark's Illerup River Valley, archaeologists from Aarhus University and Mosgard Museum spent the years between 2009 and 2014 excavating a 75-hectare peat bog that turned out to hold one of the largest deposits of processed human remains ever recovered from Iron Age Europe. Working under project leader Mads Kaler Holst, the team recovered more than 2,000 bones and bone fragments, representing a minimum of 82 directly identified individuals. Based on the density and spread of remains across the full wetland, researchers estimate the true total exceeds 380 people, almost all of them adult men. The bones tell a story in 2 separate acts. The first act is a battle. Skeletal trauma across the assemblage is consistent with edged and blunt weapons of the kind used across Northern Europe in the early decades of the 1st century of the Common Era. And the sheer number of dead, concentrated in one river valley, represents the earliest large-scale direct evidence of organized armed conflict among Germanic populations anywhere in the archaeological record. Centuries before Roman writers began describing these same populations from a comfortable distance, without ever once mentioning an event like this one specifically. The second act took longer to notice and is harder to explain. Weathering patterns and animal gnaw marks on the bones indicate the dead lay exposed on the battlefield, unburied, for approximately 6 months after they died, through an entire season, scavenged by whatever wildlife found them first. Then, roughly half a year after the fighting ended, someone returned. The bones were gathered, defleshed further where soft tissue remained, deliberately sorted, and in some cases arranged with obvious intention before being carried into the wetland and deposited in the water. During the 2014 field season, excavators recovered 4 male pelvic bones threaded directly onto a single wooden stick, arranged with a level of care that has nothing to do with disposal and everything to do with display. Bones scavenged for 6 months. Bones deliberately gathered afterward. Bones sorted, arranged, and threaded onto sticks, then carried into open water and placed there on purpose. This was published in 2018 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, using the researchers' own term for what the evidence showed. Post-battle corpse manipulation, a clinical phrase for an act that required someone to return to a field of half-rotted, scavenger-picked bodies, sort through the remains of hundreds of enemies bone by bone, and stage the results for an audience. Whoever did this did not want the aftermath hidden. A battlefield is where an army loses to another army. A wetland full of sorted, threaded, deliberately placed bones is where the victors made certain no one who saw it could mistake the outcome or forget it. The mainstream interpretation holds that Alken Enge documents a genuine, large-scale conflict followed by a deliberate, ritualized processing of the defeated enemy's remains. Victory made permanent and visible through the treatment of the dead rather than through any monument built to celebrate it. Others argue the 6-month gap and the scale of corpse sorting implies something closer to organized religious practice than simple triumphalism. A formal rite this society performed after any sufficiently large conflict, not a one-time act of humiliation. A minority position notes that Roman period Scandinavia left no written record of its own at all, meaning every explanation for Alken Enge, however well the bones support it, has to be built entirely from the evidence in the peat, with no outside account to check it against. Roman historians wrote extensively about the Germanic peoples on their northern frontier, usually as distant, half-understood adversaries, described from the safety of the empire's own side of the border. Not one surviving Roman account mentions anything resembling what happened at Alken Enge. The empire that left behind law codes, biographies, and detailed campaign histories had no record at all of one of the largest documented conflicts among the very people it spent centuries fighting. The Pete remembered what Rome's own historians never wrote down. An army obliterated in battle is one kind of catastrophe. The next entry belongs to a catastrophe that came from an entirely different direction. Not an enemy with weapons, but a society that decided the only way to stop the sky and the ocean from destroying everyone was to sacrifice the people it valued most. Number 1. The children of Huanchaquito Las Llamas. Picture a wide stretch of sand dune on Peru's northern coast, in the shadow of Chan Chan, the largest earthen city ever built in the pre-Columbian Americas, around the year 1450 of the Common Era. Rain is falling on a coastline that receives almost none in an ordinary year. Rain that has already fallen longer than anyone alive can remember. And the rivers that irrigate the Chimu Empire's fields are rising into floods instead. On this stretch of sand, priests and attendants are walking more than 140 children, most between the ages of 5 and 14, out toward the ocean in a deliberate procession, alongside more than 200 young llamas. None of them are walking back. Local residents alerted archaeologist Gabriel Prieto of Peru's National University of Trujillo to the site in 2011, after human bone began eroding out of the dunes near their homes. Excavations Prieto led between 2011 and 2016, working with physical anthropologist John Verano of Tulane University, uncovered a mass grave spread across roughly 700 square meters. The largest single episode of child sacrifice ever documented anywhere in the archaeological record, published in the journal PLOS One in March of 2019. The physical evidence is almost unbearably precise. Cut marks on the sternums and ribs of the children are consistent with the deliberate removal of the heart. Preserved in mud that was still wet when it happened and undisturbed for more than 500 years since, excavators mapped hundreds of footprints. 2 separate processions, one arriving from the north side of the site and one from the south, converging at its center. Small bare feet walk through that mud beside the 4-legged tracks of camelids. And in places, the animal tracks show clear signs of dragging and resistance. This was not a chaotic response to disaster, not a panic, a ceremony, choreographed from 2 directions at once until both processions met at the exact place where neither the children nor the animals would leave again. Isotope and cranial modification evidence indicates the children were drawn from multiple regions and ethnic groups across the wider Chimu state, not one local community. A mobilization gathered specifically for this purpose from across an empire. More than 200 llamas were sacrificed in the same event, and sediment layers at the site preserve unmistakable evidence of massive flooding contemporary with the burials, a signature scientists associate with an exceptionally severe El Niño, the same Pacific climate pattern that still reshapes weather worldwide today, on a cycle no society has ever learned to predict, only endure. What kind of calculation does a society need to make to reach this point? The Chimu built one of the most sophisticated irrigation civilizations in the pre-industrial world, engineering canals across a coastal desert to grow food reliably in a landscape that offers almost none on its own. That expertise proved powerless against the flooding that arrived around 1450. And when technical mastery failed, the Chimu state did not simply pray or wait or retreat. It organized the largest sacrifice of children ever documented anywhere on the continent, apparently believing that giving up what a society values most was the only remaining language catastrophic weather might still listen to. You do not need to be a parent to feel the weight of small footprints walking in one direction, beside larger ones toward the ocean, and never walking back the other way. Every child led onto that sand had a name someone called them by, and had already survived infancy in a world where that alone was never guaranteed. Every one of them was walked to the water anyway, because the adults responsible for their survival had run out of every other idea for saving everyone else. The mainstream interpretation ties the Huanchaquito Las Llamas sacrifice directly to catastrophic El Niño flooding striking at a politically unstable moment early in the reign of a new Chimu ruler, when the state's authority and its ability to control the weather through ritual may both have felt suddenly, publicly in question. Others note that large-scale sacrifice in the Andean world often accompanied political transitions independent of climate, and caution against reducing the event to weather alone. A minority position suggests the sacrifice may have been staged deliberately as a public demonstration of state power during a moment of crisis, using the children's deaths to reassert authority as much as to appease anything in the sky or the sea. What no interpretation disputes is the arithmetic recorded in the sand. More than 140 children, more than 200 llamas, one catastrophic event, and one physical record of what a powerful, technically sophisticated society was willing to do when nature stopped negotiating with its engineering. El Niño has not stopped. The same Pacific climate pattern Chimu priests likely believed they could appease with a child's heart still disrupts rainfall, fisheries, and agriculture worldwide today, in cycles scientists still cannot fully predict, now threatening populations measured in the hundreds of millions rather than the thousands. The mechanism the Chimu tried to bargain with has not been switched off. It has only been renamed, studied, and imperfectly modeled. Huanchaquito Las Llamas stands as evidence that technical sophistication and ritual desperation are not opposites. They are often the same society, in the same generation, reaching with both hands at once when the ground it built on stops holding still. The Chimu engineered canals that outlasted their empire by centuries, and in the same era, walked their own children into the sea. And neither fact cancels out the other. The footprints in that Peruvian sand point only one direction. What they prove, more than anything else on this list, is that a society's most careful engineering and its most unbearable choices can come from exactly the same fear, aimed at exactly the same unanswerable sky. Look back across all 10 of these sites, and a pattern becomes visible that no single entry can show on its own. None were falsified by later scholarship, and none turned out to be hoaxes or errors corrected once cooler heads prevailed. Every one of them remains exactly as real as the day it was excavated. What changed, entry after entry, was not the evidence. It was the moment a research team finally had the tool required to read what the evidence had been saying all along. A genome sequencer, a myoglobin assay, a forensic trajectory analysis, a strontium isotope reading. The bones, the coprolite, the composite skeletons, and the mummified dead were never hiding anything. They were waiting for questions specific enough to answer them. The same chemistry, a different decade. Ancient DNA sequencing, the technique that reopened Rupkund, Naya's ancestry, and the Tarim Basin mummies, barely existed as an affordable tool before the early 2010s. The trajectory analysis that turned cranium-17 into the oldest proven killing in the hominin record was published in 2015. The Tarim Basin genome study was published in 2021. As recently as 2023 and 2024, researchers were still publishing new analyses of the Cima de los Huesos remains, refining conclusions about a chamber under excavation for roughly 4 decades. None of these 10 stories is finished. Every one is still an active file on someone's desk right now. None of the people who left this evidence behind intended to be found, believed, or understood this far in the future. A Mesolithic community at Kanaljorden, a Chimu priest at Huanchaquito, a griever at Cladh Hallan piecing together an ancestor from parts. None of them built anything for an audience 400, 4,000, or 400,000 years away. They built it, buried it, or fled it for reasons that made complete sense inside lives none of us can fully reconstruct. The evidence survived by accident of chemistry and geography, cold water, dry salt, airless peat, a sealed cave. Not because anyone intended a message for the future. That is the uncomfortable center of this list. Prehistory is not a story someone is hiding from you. It is a story most of which simply did not survive to tell. And the fraction that did survive, survived in forms specific enough. A shattered pelvis, a threaded stick, a footprint walking toward the water and not back. That no amount of tidy narration can fully absorb them. The sanitizing was never a decision made in a boardroom. It happens, quietly, at the exact moment a fact becomes too physical to summarize. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.